The small town of Hebden Bridge in the Calder Valley is a chosen destination for many visitors. There's no doubt that the town's success in conserving so much of its original Victorian architecture and the attractive landscape has given the town a pleasurable atmosphere enjoyed by both local people and visitors alike. It's proved every weekend through the hundreds of people that emerge from Hebden Bridge railway station. However, these 2014 scenes were filmed on no ordinary weekend, for this was a very special day, as people came here to watch the Tour de France. We know, according to official records, that over 3.3 million spectators line the routes in Yorkshire. 340,000 did, in Calderdale alone, many of whom chose to watch it from more than one location over the course of the three-day event.
Of the 340,000, about 160 to 180,000 were from outside of the area, so they were true visitors to the area. 42% of those were from other areas in the UK, and of that 10% in Yorkshire. Obviously not as much from Yorkshire this time because the race covered Yorkshire. Absolutely massive logistical operation, but all the officers were ready for it and prepared for every eventuality.
One sad aspect of the race in Mytholmroyd was the passing away of a man whose bike shop had been part of the village scene for generations. Dougie Mansfield would have loved to have seen the Tour de France pass his old shop, but he passed away shortly before the event.
So a lot of cyclists use this road. So
there's a climb, into a long climb or something.
It's the
longest climb.
Continuous uphill in England.
That's right.
Is it really? Yeah,
It is,
starting
right.
from the library.
I didn't know that.
Yes, it is.
Yes,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
You're
All the
still
way
a cyclist, I think.
Well, you know what it's like.
Yes,
There's just a dip on the top.
From here,
right, yeah.
approximately 6 miles and a half.
Yeah.
And then you can go like the clappers downhill.
Hey,
You'll be down there in no time.
you won't. They've got speed cameras on there now, haven't they? Have you seen it?
Yes.
I've seen the sign. If it's actually working, do you
I
think
don't
it
know
is?
whether it's working.
No.
There is a point there.
I think somebody's been trying to cut the cables. I've walked down it, and somebody's been at the cables that feed it.
We needed to make sure that obviously safety was key and that they had a fantastic day. So we spoke to about 400 various people throughout various communities, basically giving them information and advice on how they can celebrate the event as businesses and local communities, so what they could do to organise their own event. Like any other Tour de France event, this was the first time that we'd had a cultural festival as part of the whole event.
When I first heard about the Tour de France coming through Yorkshire, it was very much poo-hoo. I didn't really think there'd be too much interest there. On the TV it all started to build up. People talked about it bringing lots more interest in tourism and revenue to the area.
As you know, Calderdale, we hosted the Grand Departs, which was 18 cyclists pulling a grand piano up Crag Vale, which again I think just shows how creative Calderdale is.
And I read in the newspaper that the community in Crag Vale were going to do something special for the Tour de France, and they were going to try and put bunting all the way up the continuous incline, or so far up, and beat the world record for bunting, which I think when they started was something like 3 miles. And as time went on, there was a group down south of England beat the world record, and then I think about Christmas 2013 the Australians had 10 kilometres, so it had gone up quite considerably, and we were all out set to try and beat the world record 10 kilometres, and I think we finally, when we beat the record, I think it was over 12 kilometres. The ladies that were involved with names like Isla, Elaine, Eileen, I think, they'd started it all off. And I thought, oh, I've got loads of material in my rag bag, I'll have a go at making 50 metres of bunting. In end of August, my husband had an accident, He fell down the last 2 stone steps in our house and we had to go off to hospital. And they cut off his trousers, which were grey ones. And I thought, I'm not going to waste that material, I shall put it in my bunting. And this pair of trousers was quite faded in parts and different coloured greys. And at the time there was all the publicity about the book, 50 Shades of Grey. So I thought I'll get another 50-metre tape and I'll make 50 Shades of Grey bunting. Here we are, so here's the first one, 50 Shades of Grey. So every 50 flags we had that title.
And then we had the fantastical cycle parade which took place in Todmorden, which wasn't en route, but Todmorden was so up for Tour de France coming and so happy to have a party on the back off of it. I think it really shows the credit to our communities. Because it had never been done before, the only sort of events that had taken place in Calderdale before were things like Tour of Britain coming through a number of years ago. It was an unknown for everybody, so people were really quite worried about how it would affect them and their day.
Many local schools took part too. These are Colden school children riding around their local Hebden store, Popples Common.
Hello and welcome to the Tour de Popples, June 2014. I'm tired. Bonjour, ça va?
They successfully fundraised a large sum towards their planned new classroom. It's now 10 a.m. and just like other places throughout the area, thousands of people are already lining the route, full 6 hours before the cyclists were scheduled to pass through.
So it didn't run on a rolling road closure basis, it was a full lockdown for over 12 hours. So there were lots of parking implications, people that were parked on the street up Keighley Road. So it was about creating alternative parking for them, making sure that they'd been notified in good time, etc.
For a small town like Hebden Bridge to be besieged by such massive numbers of people, there had to be some strict crowd control. If you wanted to watch from the other side of the road on Commercial Street, you had to cross it before 10 a.m.
Because we could see there was a gap where you could stand near the fence and we could have a good view with a grandchild, where this warden in a yellow jacket came over to us and said, I'm sorry you can't go there, this is only for people that live here. So my husband said, because there's other people that you've just let through, and if they can go and watch near the fence, so can I. At that, the warden put his foot near the pushchair. My husband manoeuvred the pushchair out of the way so we could get to the fence and carried on. But about 15, probably 20 minutes later, a policeman came up to my husband and said, you know, you've just harassed this warden, took all his details and everything. And at the back of my mind, I was thinking that my husband was going to be in a cell somewhere. I was thinking there was going to be headlines on front of the Hebden Bridge paper on Friday with my husband and grandchild, and then it was going to be put in prison for it.
The area was very, very well stewarded, so if those people had been told that they couldn't access a particular area, there would have been a good reason for it.
Sponsors start coming through with all their custom-made cars and fancy dress, throwing out all kinds of things representing their products. The kids were delighted.
Wonderful time.
In Yorkshire, it's done its, they've really gone to town on it, really gone to town.
Didn't really get it myself, but as time went on, momentum built. People started asking me about the Tour de France coming through Hebden Bridge. People from outside the area, friends, business associates, and it gathered more and more potential. Spoke to a number of people about what they were going to do on the day, and were invited to a friend who had a cottage at Calder Bridge. So we set off walking in the morning, early doors, lots of people starting to stake the place by the side of the road, quite impressed. Got to the friend who was hosting the party, his house was full, hardly any room for anybody else. The barbecue set up, and a party atmosphere started.
Yeah, we got there for about 6 and we were stood outside at road waiting on the corner and other people were there. And we were there about 5 or 6 hours, and this couple with the 2 children just came. We thought they were just taking some photos of what was drawn on the road, but they actually stayed there in front of us, and they wouldn't move. We asked them to move, and the man says, "Well, what are you going to do about it? We've come to watch as well as you." Yeah, you know, and then the bikes came, but we couldn't get our pictures. You know, my brother-in-law had his camera all set and that, but he couldn't get any proper pictures because they were stood in the way, and that were it. You know, and there was nothing we could do about it really, apart from throw him over the wall, but my wife wouldn't let me do that.
So where have you come from?
New Zealand.
Very good.
Up there on the top.
The publicity caravan came through at a fast rate, the police bikes came through at a fast rate, and then the cyclists came through at a fast rate.
We were discussing how we could promote Wadsworth. We were wondering why the Crag Vale Road was getting all the publicity, because it was the longest stretch of uphill road in Britain, and how we could sort of compete with that. My father was a local historian. My father had mentioned that the road had actually been built by the French prisoners of war, Napoleonic prisoners of war. And I thought it was a good idea to have something to welcome these guys. They're coming from France, visitors from France, and what better than to have a mock-up of the Arc de Triomphe at the top of Cockhill, with a sign which basically says, "Not there yet, but you are in Wadsworth." Hebden Bridge. It was built by their forebears, and it would be the only road in Britain that was built by the French.
Of course, another thing they wouldn't know was that further down the Keighley Road, they'd be within sight of the Eiffel Tower. Built in 1893 at the time of the Great Paris Exhibition, a Hebden Bridge dentist built and named not only this house, but also the street of houses behind it, and called it Eiffel Street. Not only was the tower an elegant addition, but it very likely acted as a buttress against slipping down the steep Birchcliff hillside.
I got slightly drenched and slightly sticky from the leftover debris of what was in one of the bottles of the Tour de France saline sticky solution.
Well, we've heard from the cyclists that they absolutely loved coming to Yorkshire. They'd never experienced anything like it. One of the famous cyclists, but he said he felt like he'd been at an all-night club, because when he got back to his camp, there was ringing in his ears because the screaming was that loud. He said he'd never experienced anything like it. I was fortunate to go to the opening ceremony of Tour de France, because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to watch it on the day. And the cyclists were actually coming out to film the crowd with their iPads because they were so excited, and they'd never been treated like superstars before. So they loved it. Yeah.
But 2014 was not only the year of the Tour de France. There were some significant anniversaries. One was the 700th birthday of Bridge Mill, one of the oldest events recorded in the area's history. David Fletcher saved the building for posterity.
It frightened me to death. It was in such a terrible state that I didn't know what to do with it. But I worked a 20-hour weekend for the next 5 years, getting rid of the worst rot and repairing what I could with my own limited DIY ability, until I could start to get some tenants in and then borrow against the rent and keep doing it bit by bit until we have got to where we are today. Don't think we've finished yet, but we are making progress.
Nowadays, of course, Hebden Bridge itself, although it still supports businesses like Colrec, is based on the visitor economy. And this mill, that was the birth of Hebden Bridge as a manufacturing area, was also part of its rebirth with all the work that David did once the mills had actually closed down within Hebden Bridge itself. Something like a water wheel, time turning. So the first revolution was the Industrial Revolution, and the second revolution is the revolution that we've had in relation to the visitor economy.
This building was built, initially started in 1314. That's the same year as the Battle of Bannockburn, when the Scots were fighting for their independence.
You're taking my line. Damn!
Right away, we both think that it's really quite appropriate that here we are again.
The first building to be built here on the side of the stream, it was surrounded by marsh hundreds of years before the town was ever envisaged. It was a flour mill, powered by a water wheel.
At that time, it was the Lord of the Manor of Wadsworth's corn mill. He only lived about a year to enjoy it, but his widow then took over the lordship of the manor, and she put a tenant into the mill named Stephen the miller, who was also quite a lad, because he featured prominently in the court rolls of the time. Another resident of the area allowed a couple of horses and some pigs to come and eat the grass that belonged to the miller, and he drove the horses away, and they subsequently got lost, and he ate the pigs. And so he was in court for this. So a pretty colourful sort of history. We know that the mill stood next to the original bridge in Hebden Bridge, which was a timber structure which preceded the what we today call the old bridge. That old bridge wasn't built until 1510. So the mill had been there nearly 200 years. But there is in the records of the mill a fine which is levied on anyone winnowing their corn on the bridge. Obviously, bridges often become fairly drafty places as the wind goes up and down the river. So it would be a good place to winnow your corn, to throw it up in the air and separate the corn from the chaff. But this obviously would impede traffic on the bridge, and it was illegal. And the fine was quite hefty, sixpence.
In 2010, the town celebrated the 500th anniversary of its beautiful Packhorse Bridge, built in 1510.
Mr. Frank Woolridge from the Hebden Bridge Historical Society.
I need you to imagine what it was like around here 500 years ago when it was built. I think one of the surprising facts that comes out of this is Henry VIII just married Catherine of Aragon. He'd come to the throne and he was 18 years old. That was when this bridge was built.
A packhorse was even led over the bridge as part of the celebration. The Hebden 500 Festival had events all year. Including this English Civil War reenactment by the Steel Knot Society. The occasion in 1643, when cavaliers from Halifax clashed across the River Hebden with the Roundheads from Heptonstall. But these royalists weren't too lucky. Stormy winds and heavy rain lashed the hillside, and many of these men were swept away in the swollen current of the River Hebden.
So the parliamentarian forces coming down the hill, again mostly musketeers and clubmen I would imagine, were able to get right up to the royalist forces, force them back across the river, force them back across the bridge. Many men drowned, many men killed apparently at the crossing there. The parliamentarians, being the successful force, apparently suffered no fatalities in the immediate battle, except for the commanding officer, Major Eden, who died of his wounds. The only other known fatality of the battle on the parliamentarian side was a man, Joseph Priestley, who died as a result of his own good actions, because he apparently dived into the stream to save a royalist, then went on sentry duty without changing his clothes, caught pneumonia and died as a result of being immersed in the water saving a royalist.
Eventually they did fight them off and entered the village, but only to find the place empty. They were so angry that they set about razing the houses to the ground. A total of 14 houses were completely destroyed. Many more were seriously damaged. The village was completely decimated. In the 18th century, the construction of the toll road through the Calder Valley and the digging of the Rochdale Canal would lay the foundation for the Industrial Revolution that would transform the regions on both sides of the Pennines in the 1900s. Another 2014 anniversary was organised by the Calder Civic Trust, who marked the bicentenary of the building of the original monument with this celebration at the summit of Studley Pike. Todmorden Council sponsored the event and Todmorden Community Band performed. In 1814, the whole nation was celebrating in the streets. The Treaty of Paris had been signed on the 31st of March. Local people were relieved that over 20 years of Napoleonic wars had finally come to an end. They wanted to build a lasting memorial to such a momentous achievement. French people visiting from Todmorden's twin town of Ronk were invited to take part in celebrating the 200 years of peace between the two countries. They entered into the spirit of the occasion, producing and bringing T-shirts with Studley Pike Monument on them.
As Todmorden Mayor-elect, I'd like to welcome you all here to Studley Pike, especially our visitors from Ronk. Hope you're enjoying your stay with us. This monument has become the identifying structure of Todmorden. A structure that all locals and Hebden Bridge. I'll carry on as Mayor of Todmorden. Perhaps few people will know its historic significance. Many people wrongly link it to the Battle of Waterloo and the peace that followed in 1815. But Studley Pike was originally built to mark the signing of the Treaty of Paris in May 1814, which is why we're here today. So it's making it one of the oldest monuments of peace in the world. So
Giant sunbirds, courtesy of the handmade parade, danced to their samba band. Just over 150 years ago, and on the very day when the Russian ambassador was expelled from Britain at the start of the Crimean War in 1854, the original monument was struck by lightning and destroyed. The Halifax Guardian pronounced it as an evil omen that this structure dedicated to peace should fall on the declaration of war. The climax of the day's event was when homing pigeons were to be released from the monument to symbolically fly back to France.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. By saying I have no doubt that Studley Pike will be here for another 200 years, so perhaps we can all return then and do it all again.
As for the very small community of local people in Hebden Bridge in the early years of the 19th century, they evidently didn't require much excuse to have a celebration, as witnessed by contemporary reports of the annual Brig races every summer. Not many of these patient spectators here will know that they're reenacting an ancient local tradition. At that time, 200 years ago, there was only one house on Commercial Street, the Toll House, almost like today. But in between then and now, the road was a main thoroughfare, and until the 1960s was fronted by several terraces of homes and shops. Participants would run quite naked from the door of the 17th century White Lion Inn, the oldest building in the town, to the gates of Mayroyd Hall, though occasionally one would wear a girdle around his loins.
My dad, he used to drive for the White Lion. There were some horses round the back with traps and wagons. He said they used to do it every year, this race, you know, for new underclothes.
Women would be permitted to wear a chemise, and if she won, she would then be awarded a prize of a brand new one. Rather less substantial was the prize awarded to the man. He'd be presented with a new hat.
From the early 1840s, the railway came to this valley, and a man who worked on the railways all his life was Mr. Lloyd Greenwood.
The video that there is of 1966 of the Calder Valley begins with a shot of the train coming into Hebden Bridge station, and there's Walter Dobson, who worked there for many years. Walter's shouting, "Hebden Bridge! Hebden Bridge!" Hebden Bridge! And across here, there lived a lady called Miss Ingram, lived across here in these houses here. And we had a poster on this wall somewhere, it isn't there now. She said, they come on that platform and sit and watch me. Well, of course, it was a picture of a man. I don't know what it was they were doing. And so she said, and I don't like it, you'll have to stop it. You'll have to stop that man looking at me. Yeah. Anyway, for some time, with some men doing some work. And she came down from up there with a jug of water and poured it on this chap who sat on this seat. Never. She said, that will teach you, she said. And on this corner there was a toolbar house.
The small building on the left-hand side underneath Royd House is the Toll House.
This 1856 photograph of the Croft shows a Hebden Bridge without most of its current shopping centre. The only buildings that exist follow the line of the river, and you can see the back of the White Swan public house in the distance. People are enjoying the Sunday School Jubilee on fields that would soon cease to be. Just after these Whit Monday festivities, the fields were divided into building plots and sold off for development. The town centre area of Albert Street, Crown Street and Hope Street came into being. Exactly 150 years ago, in May 1865, an important meeting in the White Horse Inn was attended by 500 local people, and a vote was taken on whether to carve a new district out of the existing parishes of Wadsworth, Heptonstall and Errington. They voted to create a specific new administrative district for Hebden Bridge, to be governed by a local board. However, the vote was extremely close. 230 opposed and 247 supported it. This area would expand several times in the decades that followed, before the first Urban District Council met on the 28th of December 1894. In 1893, St George's Bridge was built over the River Hebden in approximately the same place as the earliest wooden bridge by the mill. There was to be a grand opening.
And as was the custom of the day, the county councillors came to Hebden Bridge and prior to the ceremony decided that they needed to have a little earlier celebration and a slap-up meal at the White Lion Inn. And the food supplied there and the hospitality must have been quite substantial, because they were significantly late emerging from the White Lion Inn to actually perform the ceremony. And the crowds were getting somewhat restive when one among their number, a local character known as Old Dog, decided that he was going to take matters into his own hands, and he cut the tape, declared the bridge open, and everyone was marching backwards and forwards across it with great hilarity by the time that the councillors appeared.
The opening of the new bridge led to the creation of the new council offices on the other side of the river, a building that was felt to be under threat in the 21st century, after the Pitt Street Adult Education Building was sold off by Calderdale Council. For 110 years, the Town Hall and Council offices have been a landmark building in Hebden Bridge. It's a fine building. In fact, its architectural importance is recognised by its classification as a Grade II listed building. But taking over a historic building is not a light undertaking, and it's important to make sure that a community trust will be able to ensure the Town Hall's long-term financial viability.
This fine building, which is a Grade II listed building, this belongs to you out there, all of us, and it's up to us to help to protect, preserve and make this fine building usable into the 21st century.
Of course, 100 years ago, Hebden Bridge Station was already a busy place, not just for industry, but for tourists as well. The gateway to Hardcastle Crags. Lines of wagonettes such as this one would transport them to what had become one of the most popular weekend destinations of the day. They were generally overcrowded and not cheap, and there were accidents. Many preferred to walk. However, by 1914, the whole country was at war. And 100 years later, Hebden Bridge, just like everywhere else in Britain, marked the grim centenary of the start of World War I. This ecumenical church service in Hope Baptist Chapel in the centre of Hebden Bridge on Sunday the 3rd of August 2014 was part of a programme of events organised locally in the Calder Valley. For the first time since the end of the war, a roll of honour had been prepared, which commemorates all 434 of the local lads who'd taken part and sacrificed their lives in the service of their country during that war. This is a photograph of local recruits.
I've always thought that this gentleman, or this young boy here, has a very, very familiar face and reminds me of my grandfather. Now, he was very keen to sign up. He would be 14 at this time, or roundabout, and he was obviously inspired by these men going out. When he was 16, he actually went and signed up without his mother's knowledge. He's obviously been wounded. We knew he was wounded on the Somme.
These are just one or two things that my grandfather told me. They would get clothes, although the khaki uniform was, he said it was very scratchy, thick and hot. New boots, which a lot of them didn't have, so their boots were all patched up. And meals. 3 meals a day.
On the 24th of August 1914, 2 days after the first shot was fired by the British Army in the Great War, Tom and Jane Greenwood's son from East Parade in Mythenroy was killed. He was probably the first soldier from this district killed in the Great War. John was one of between 10 and 16 million dead worldwide, almost 30 million missing, wounded, disabled and disfigured. But John wasn't a statistic. To Tom and Jane, he was their lad and he was dead.
In 1919 and the decades afterwards, the people who stood in front of war memorials regarded them from a viewpoint that is almost impossible now for us to understand, for many of us to understand. That is bereavement in war. Yes, the fallen were soldiers, they were sailors. But before that, they were sons, they were brothers, they were husbands and fathers, uncles, cousins, fiancés. They were your neighbour at number 7, the canary fancier, your teammate. They were the local song and dance man, the cinema attendant. And that's what we wanted this roll of honour to show, that these were people, ordinary people. And that is how the bereaved and grieving loved ones remembered them. Loved and well loved.
One of those young men was Herbert Norris, born in Heptonstall, who lived with his wife and 5-year-old daughter in Mythenroyd when he was called up. Kathleen Edson, his granddaughter, was at the service in Hope Baptist Chapel and was pleased to find him in the list. She'd seen his name in the list on the Menning Gate, but had never seen any listing of his name in Britain.
I were pleased I'd found him, but it's so sad that they had to lose their lives, and we never knew his grandfather. Well, as grandparents, we never knew him. Grandma and my mum, it looks as if they've been to a wedding or something there, because she's got flowers as if she's been a bridesmaid or something. And the picture of Grandad, Herbert Norris, she had him put on that picture at Alice Longstaff's because she wanted him to be on that picture, and obviously he died. So it were a bit of a memorial for Grandma and my mum. She wrote a letter, did her mum, a letter dated 5th of November from his widow. I thank you for your reply of the first instant, but as the word missing is very vague, I should like to enquire further into my husband's case and try to relieve the awful suspense I am subject to at present. The report on the death of Herbert Norris has been accepted as sufficient evidence for official purposes, and that the date of death has been assumed to be between 25th 9:15 and 2nd of 11:15.
No mockeries now for them, no prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires.
Local sound and ice sculpture artist Jamie Wardley from Sand in Your Eye Productions captured the spirit of the anniversary with his poignant contribution to the commemoration. This was produced in the courtyard of the town hall from over 10 tons of sand. The sand was barrowed in all day on the Monday by volunteers that included the Hebden Brdige Mayor himself.
The sculpture is a young woman who is opening a letter that reads, "We are sorry to inform you that your husband has been killed in action." And the concept is the moment at which she reads this letter and the emotion of which she feels. We're actually going to extend it because we're going to age her. And the reason is that we make her first middle-aged and then elderly. And the reason is to show that the loss doesn't go, that it may be there for a moment, but initially, but it will continue, and it always goes on. And that's why the sculpture is called Loss is Eternal.
Leonard Lord from Blackshaw Head went to war and was killed in 1918. His family used this simple verse for his memorial. Somewhere in France he is lying, at rest with the valiant dead. We shall grieve and we shall miss him. All we have now is an empty vacant chair. We shall linger to caress it while we say our evening prayer.
It's sobering to note that it took 100 years to establish a genuine number of local lads killed in the course of World War I. However, Hebden Bridge and Mythenroyd, like everywhere else, lived through another world war, some devastating floods, and 2 of the worst winters in living memory. Local people were resilient, and despite foreign companies producing textiles more cheaply than they could, many mills and sewing shops survived through the 1950s and 1960s, even though the writing did seem to be on the wall.
Hebden Bridge and the surrounding area, and Mythenroyd as well, is still an area where there is a lot of work. There's something like 30% of people who work in this area still work in manufacturing, which is twice the amount in percentage-wise than in Halifax.
Hebden Bridge Band won awards, and the valley was alive with the music of countless choirs.
Our local over 60s choir was formed in 1957. We have 35 members, and the average age is just over 70.
These films were produced by the Cine section of the Literary and Scientific Society, which started the successful Little Theatre and the Camera Club. They also had thriving societies in local history, astronomy, natural history and Esperanto. Local people started the famed International Dock Pudding Festival.
It was my pleasant duty to be one of the judges, complete
And
with
how
Jay.
could you judge dock pudding?
Well, because I enjoyed it. And
Yeah.
I mean, I never thought I would ever put it past my lips. And that was the first time I did.
Not really. Yes.
I found it was delicious.
How sad.
And a successful run of arts festivals. The town was visited by some famous artists.
Sadler's Wells Ballet,
John
Travelling
Ogden.
Company. We had John Ogden, the wonderful pianist.
Barrow Poets.
Barrow Poets were part of the fringe activities.
The first time I ever heard the beautiful Albani's guitar concerto was John Williams. John Williams came and packed the cinema.
Yes, we had.
However, all was not well. The M62 was still not built, and the big lorries still thundered through the town on the A646. Young people were leaving, many to take advantage of free polytechnic and university education and not returning. Others were finding better paid jobs elsewhere. And bulldozers were waiting for people to be rehomed because half the housing had been condemned and was by now scheduled for slum clearance. The Hebden Bridge we know today would have been totally destroyed. Which is why, exactly 50 years ago, in this valley, the Calder Civic Trust was born. When you look at these scenes in Hebden Bridge, you could never imagine that the town in 1965 was about to be demolished. Very little of the housing in St George's Square or Bridgegate would still exist. The survival of Hebden Bridge, Mytholmroyd and the 5 parishes that surround them is inextricably bound up with the story of the Calder Civic Trust. Founded in the 1960s by a dedicated group of local people concerned with protecting the area's heritage.
So if there was a dirty, scruffy corner somewhere, we'd find out who owned it and ask their permission to make a little garden there. And we'd do the physical work. We used to meet on Sunday mornings, a whole group of us, various ages. One of the nice things was it brought together people of my own age, early 20s, along with older people who had the same vision of trying to do something to change the place for the better, not just let it change for the worse. And we used to do that virtually every Sunday morning. When we finished one project, we'd look for something else to do. We planted trees, we planted a wood to show that you could do something different with our hillsides. We tried as far as we could to do practical projects which would have an impact, which would show people what could be done. That was the first thing. The other was to try and publicise to people what the qualities of the area were. We all felt it had remarkable qualities, as indeed the world now knows. But at that time, it was generally run down by locals and nobody outside the locality knew it. So we set about trying to show them. We did slideshows. We mixed in those slideshows things which needed changing, things that were changing, with some of the beautiful countryside around and some of the interesting and characterful spots that we had. It was interesting going around and showing to groups where we got people saying, were those pictures really all taken around here? It showed the fact that people were unappreciative of what they had on their doorstep.
Photographer Alan Greenwood, who was involved at the very start of the Trust, is here revisiting the places he featured in an exhibition at that time. The photos drew attention to the many run-down and derelict sites that disfigured the area. Some of these were down to insufficient care by individuals, but there were also a sizable number of areas that were blighted with the remnants of the demolition process and simply left in ruins.
And he suggested taking pictures, and he got his brother-in-law to go with him, dressed very smartly in a suit and bowler hat, and he took him in looking as though we were inspecting all these sites, and we put on an exhibition, and again it was surprising how much impact it had, because quite a few of these sites magically got better. Things were improved, and there's probably one or two you can still find that haven't been improved, but generally speaking we started to have some sort of impact. But above all, it was reaching the hearts of the people and saying, look, and the minds of the people, and saying, look, this is an area worth keeping, worth improving. Let's shout about it.
People consider today that the picturesque little town of Hebden Bridge was fortunate to escape the serious bout of urban renewal that was affecting other places at that time. This was when the Victorian hearts of town centres all over Britain were being torn out. Street patterns of towns throughout the country, which had not changed since medieval times, were being swept away. There was often very little consideration as to whether the buildings had any architectural merit, and little or no respect shown for their importance in history. This, for instance, is the 700-year-old Palace House, which up until the 1960s stood in Fairfield, Hebden Bridge. A 14th century stone building full of ancient oak beams, which was originally the home of the warden of the Errington Royal Deer Forest. He was responsible for the great fence, or palisade, which throughout the 1300s ran along the entire circumference of the park and followed the line of what is now Palace House Road. This historic building was simply swept away before anyone had a chance to object. Another remarkable building, much newer but no less special, was the new Wesleyan Methodist Church and Sunday School, which stood elegantly on the corner at Foster Lane, Hebden Bridge. The architecture was inspired by the majestic Russian churches of St. Petersburg with their great domes. This is the perspective drawn by the eminent architect who was responsible, W.H. Cockcroft. He was Kathleen Iredale's great-grandfather.
The new Wesleyan Chapel and School proposed to be built at Foster Lane, so that was my great-granddad's design. There's a picture of him at the Stone Lane. He was a very tall person because he towers above everybody else, and he designed it with onion domes because he really admired the onion domes in Russia, which came about. I think he'd done this in 1903, and I think it was opened in 1904. So this is how he wanted it to look, and that's how it did look.
It's a beautiful, beautiful design, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it was lovely. And as I say, to fill that, I can't remember, I think Salem Chapel held 1,500, like it said. But this wasn't just as big as Salem, but I would think at least 1,000. And so on special services, I remember throngs of people here and wandering around down there, and the doors open and everybody joining in the hymns. It was lovely.
But in the case of Hebden Bridge, we're not just talking about the demolition of individual buildings with special architectural significance. There was a plan to destroy the absolutely unique Victorian street pattern that has made the town so special. This is Bridge Lanes. There were several thousand people living here in a network of streets rising up the side of a steep valley. A fascinating area interlinked by flights of steps, cobbled streets, backyards, snickets and gindles. And between them were the top and bottom houses, now appreciated as being the hallmark of the town's unique character. There were in fact many older buildings there. High Street was an early thoroughfare and had some attractive 18th century cottages with mullioned windows.
That was different because at one end, what we call the neck end, coming out onto Hepton Store Road, those houses were very poor, very tiny. But as it got towards the Cuckoo Steps at the other end, it got better and better. Because at the Cuckoo Steps end, there was our family's joiner's shop, Cockcroft's Joiners. And next door to them lived my great-great-aunt Maria, who owned the joiner's shop, and who also owned quite a lot of the houses up High Street. And John Cockcroft remembered going with his father to pay rent. On a certain day, they had to go to pay rent to Maria Cockcroft, who sat in her front room and this long queue of people came to pay her rent. And he remembered a tiny little old lady, all in black, with very sharp features and little granny glasses. So that's what I remember about High Street.
In actual fact, many of the later Victorian houses were spacious and comfortable. Past residents say that they enjoyed life there, certainly didn't want to leave them. However, none of this appeared to matter to the councillors of the day.
One of the discoveries that I made when I was elected to the old Hebden Brdige Urban District Council was that the environmental health officer at the time, a Major Tyndall, stand up and salute, short back and sides at Major Tyndall, had put, had condemned houses that, in his opinion, did not come up to the government standards. There was a thing called a 12-point standard, and you could condemn just about any house on it. If the ceilings weren't 8 foot high, if they were only 7 foot 9 inches high, it wasn't fit for habitation. If it had an inconvenient staircase, it wasn't fit for human habitation. Clearly, if it didn't have an indoor bathroom or it didn't have a hot water system, I mean, there were 12 points, some of which were very sensible and some were very fringe. And Mr. Tyndall was a stickler for the rules. And so I got this list, and about a third of the houses in Hebden Bridge were on it. It was just going to completely decimate the town. And he was starting. He'd already made a start before I joined the council. He was slowly working his way through area after area. The largest area that he'd completed at that time was adjacent to Bridge Lanes, between Bridge Lanes and Heptonstall Road, where about 250 higgledy-piggledy houses linked by little alleys and streets and flights of steps. A real curiosity. If they were there today, they'd be worth a fortune. They all went, and the people living in a house that was condemned got virtually nothing, because once a house had been classified as a slum, the government decided it was worth nothing. And so if it was your house and it was knocked down, you got nothing for it. You got paid a paltry sum for the imaginary value of the land, which might be £6, £8, £10, depending on the footprint of the house. It was an absolute scandal. People came to the committee and cried. Their life was going before their eyes. I remember old ladies from King Street, a row of cottages alongside the main road, opposite the Stubbing Wharf, on what is now called Brown's site. At the time it was known as Pickles's, not Brown's, because Pickles's engineering works stood there, and they owned all the cottages, and the cottages were occupied by widows of former workers at the foundry. And they point blank refused to evict these old ladies and told the council, well, you know, we believe in looking after these old people as best we can. They are happy in these houses, they don't want to go, and therefore, as far as we're concerned, they are not going. Major Tyndall persevered, and the houses were condemned, were compulsorily purchased, and the old ladies were turfed out and put in old folks' homes. They came to the committee. I remember clearly one old lady saying, look, I got bathed in a tin bath in front of the fire all my life, and I'm over 80 now, and I've no objection to carrying on that way until I go, but I don't want to be moved into some old folks' home. They got moved. They all got moved compulsorily. Most of them were dead in less than a year.
My sister-in-law and her mum and dad, they lived underneath, on the underneath side of Queen's Terrace, and they were only rented. But I do know of one particular person that was buying his home. He eventually left, and supposedly the local authority bought the property. And I know him and his family went into a council house, and it was quite a long while after we were chatting, and he just happened to come out with that they'd offered him £8. I said, what for? He said, the house. I couldn't believe it, and I knew that he wouldn't have said that unless it was true. And of course, I've heard it mentioned since by other people that they were only offered £8 for a house. And those houses are still up, Queen's Terrace, still being lived in. And so it makes you realise what compulsory purchase is all about. In other words, robbing people.
It came about, like a lot of things in politics do, the law of unintended consequences. The Labour government of the day was fighting slum landlords, particularly a chap called Rackman. And they were determined they were going to put these slum landlords out of business. And the way they would do it would be to demolish all their slum properties and pay them no compensation. Well, okay, that might have been just what Mr. Rackman deserved. But, you know, once the law's been written, it gets applied by every ritualistic bureaucrat the length and breadth of the land. And we almost lost just about the whole town of Hebden Bridge if Major Tyndall hadn't been stopped in his tracks. And that was one of the things that I took it upon myself to do as a councillor. And fortunately, legislation began to change. The possibility of obtaining improvement grants to improve so-called slum property rather than demolish it appeared in the 1968 Housing Act, and gradually I was able to persuade the council to change its tune, and much to the dismay of the said Mr. Tyndall, we started to encourage people to accept grants, which at one stage were as high as 95%, to improve properties in order to make them fit.
Councillors were determined to remove these intriguing streets of houses perched on the side of a steep hill, whatever negative advice they received. And this had included a warning from their own respected architect, John Cockcroft. Your grandfather became involved there, didn't he?
Yes, he went to survey the ground because the council were thinking about putting some high-rise flats there when they'd knocked High Street down and Croft Place, Kershaw Steps. And he went to survey the ground and said it wasn't suitable for high-rise flats.
He had inspected the site and told them about the instability of the slope and its unsuitability for what they had in mind. He was, of course, proved correct. In fact, the removal of buildings in this area caused the ground to become so unstable that a substantially built terrace on Heptonstall Road above the incline and not scheduled for demolition also had to be taken down, and even more people suddenly had to leave their much-loved homes. As if not satisfied to simply demolish all the houses, the remains were left standing for years, and the whole approach to the town was dominated by this stark landscape of ruins and rubble.
And we basically wrote to everybody we thought we could do, that we could possibly influence, begging them to clean up, help, tidy up, sort out, and generally improve the area. And among other things, we managed to get money, which we were able to use in a way that the council couldn't, to improve the site at the bottom of Heptonstall Road, where the terraces had been demolished. We were able to get that landscaped and planted with trees and flowers, as it is to this day. That was the point. We got the money, and we were able to use the money to get contractors to do this. It wasn't something we could tackle as we'd done our little projects. That was quite different.
It was sites like these that led a young biology teacher at Calder High School, David Fletcher, to set up the Calder Civic Trust.
By 1965, 60% of the shops in Hebden Bridge were permanently closed. And I'm not just expressing a disappointment, it was terrible. It gave a terrible feeling to the town. The windows get broken, the windows that are not broken get covered in grime, and if it's not grime, it's last year's circus posters flapping in the breeze. It's just dreadful. It just gives a feeling of demoralisation to everyone who sees it. I could point you out someone who actually bought a house in Hebden Bridge for a penny. There was such a paucity of people wanting to come and live here. Quite a large house, a house that today is quite attractive. It used to be a club. It was a desperate, desperate time. And it was in this spirit that Calder Civic Trust came into being. It was definitely 1965, and it was round about the 1st of May, for a guess. And I'd been walking, Alan Greenwood and I often shared walks, and we were coming down from Hartcastle Crags past Lee Mill, which was there in those days, and we walked along the path between the dam and the river, coming down towards Foster Mill. As we came down there, passing below Windsor Terrace and Windsor View, we looked up, and what a mess. It has to be said, in those days the town was at its lowest ebb, with a great loss of population, people just leaving in droves to look for work elsewhere, as all the factories in this area just went down like dominoes. And people just chucked stuff out. There was no council collection, there was no council collection centre, and most people didn't have transport anyway to cart large items of furniture about. They just chucked them down the wood. There were three-piece suites, there were all sorts of things there. It was rife, this was everywhere, this was the district. And Alan and I walked down there, and this was the final straw, the thing that prompted the, we've had enough. This is our district, potentially so beautiful, and yet so polluted, so black with soot and smoke, so disorderly with rubbish thrown everywhere, the people so demoralised. We've got to do something to try and put a stop to this, to try to improve the area and help people to see it in a different light.
There had been 33 mill closures in Hebden Bridge in the last 10 years. Hebden Bridge counted among the top 10 towns in the country suffering from population decline. For many politicians in power at the time, the only answer seemed to lie in knocking everything down and starting again. And thus began the bitter battle to save Buttress Brink, the fascinating terrace built into the steep hillside above the ancient packhorse route to Heptonstall. At the bottom you entered this extraordinary structure through a dark tunnel, leading through a unique network of alleyways, an interconnecting maze of stone steps and flagged landings. Built at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, it predated the majority of buildings in the town by about 50 years. Nobody doubted that this rundown accommodation was in dire need of modernisation. But if it had survived another 15 years, it could have been ideal for artist studios and the type of people who were about to arrive in the town and make it their home.
There is somewhere around the back in Naples, which is very similar to the Buttress. And my granddad had been there because he said, I've been and seen this area in Naples. It's so like the Buttress. And people are living there, and they've got flowers and hanging baskets. And they thought the Buttress could be like that.
Your grandfather became involved there, didn't he?
Yes, he went to survey the ground and thought that was good for another 100 years.
Unless he's on that picture.
He's on that picture, yes. When he went to the Buttress, yes, he went round the back and people saw him and, waved and asked him in for tea and cakes. And he said some of the little houses were lovely. And people were really proud, And that's why I thought it was a shame to knock that down. People didn't look at it as somewhere that could be made attractive. It was a sort of dark, huge building dominating the bottom of the Buttress. There was a little tunnel, a little entrance, which we were told never to go in or look in, but people had to go through that entrance to get around the other side.
This was a very special place. It's possible that if this unique building had survived, it might have ranked as fascinating to visitors as the Rose in Chester or the Shambles in York. But sadly, this was not to be.
Structurally, they were quite sound. And today, instead of 50, there might have been 10 dwellings there. But they would have been exciting dwellings, and they would have certainly added to the character of the town. The Calder Civic Trust was about a year old, and we actually drew up some alternative plans. And we did get the opportunity to take them and put them before council officers. But it didn't make any difference. Really, if I'm honest, everybody thought we were mad, trying to save something so squalid.
With considerable difficulty, demolition people struggled to remove this very substantial, iconic building, one that sadly could never be replaced. The Calder Civic Trust lost this battle, but the fuss they created made people aware of what the councillors were doing to the town they loved.
I can see why we didn't get what we wanted, but that was one scheme that failed. It wasn't the only one. In the early days, we had ideas that didn't happen. The buttress was one. Another one was Mytham Hall, might have been 1800. But it was a very nice mill owner's mansion. The council had decided it wanted to build an old people's home there. And so they wanted to demolish the building, which they said was in a bad state of repair. Well, it did have some dry rot, but, you know, so what? Dry rot can be cured. We fought hard to save Mytham Hall. In the end, we didn't manage to save it. We'd meetings on site with the architects who were designing the new hall. We wanted it to be kept as the sort of focal point and the community rooms for the new old people's home. But no, the council dug their heels in. It had to go. But we did manage. We were beginning to get a better hearing. We said, look, there's this beautiful hall. It's going away. We don't particularly like your scheme, and it's built of brick, which is incompatible with the character of this area. We did achieve a building in stone, a set of buildings in stone, and the architect did, I think, a very good job. We were sorry to see the hall go, but we did get low-rise, 2 stories, apartments for the elderly people in stone, in the local vernacular style, and sort of spread out a little bit like terraces, and it looked well. Of course, it's gone now. You know, we're talking about the 1970s when it was built. This is local authorities for you. They can afford to just throw it away and build something else. And we've now got those 2 large, rather utilitarian blocks out of character with the area in the place of the one that we fought so hard to get in character with the area. A disappointment.
It was perhaps the demolition of one of Hebden Bridge's most ancient inns, the 18th century White Horse Inn on St George's Square, that made people realise that they should be vigilant in protecting the buildings in their town. You can see the White Horse in the background of this 1860s photograph of people working on their allotment in the croft, now looking from Crown Street towards St George's Square. Within 10 years of this photograph, the main area of the town would be built, and this view would change forever.
Well, I think it was built in 1789 perhaps, by William Patchett, of the family that lived at the White Lion were Patchetts. I remember my granddad saying, how sad, there's a lovely building like that. And he found out that somebody, not he hadn't surveyed it, but somebody had gone in and found a lot of rat droppings in the cellar, and said straight away, this building must be condemned. And my granddad said, well, all they need to do is put a lot of lime down and get rid of the rats. Nobody had heard about these rats until somebody from the council had said, oh, well, that's the reason we're pulling it down.
They also pulled down the terraces at Garden Street, constructed on the garden of the White Horse Inn, and the very first top and bottom houses to be built in the town. The back-to-earth bottom 2 floors fronting onto Garden Street were certainly run down. Their 2 upper floors fronting onto Commercial Street were in reasonable condition and enjoyed fine elevated views of the town, a point that cannot have escaped David Fletcher when a few years ago he produced plans to develop the Garden Street area again, but with modern blocks of apartments. Their ultra-modern design was deeply unpopular, and they were successfully branded by opponents as the wonky houses. The planning application failed.
I'm still excited by new ideas, new development, but they need to reflect the past. So, I mean, that was my thinking when I got involved with the Garden Street. I have to admit that, like many other people, I was a little taken aback when I saw the architect's first draft of his drawings, and I did propose that they be sort of toned down a bit. I anticipated that we would have trouble. So in answer to your question, do I feel betrayed? Not at all, not at all. The Calder Civic Trust today is a very different beast to the Calder Civic Trust we had. And it's more in tune with some of the latter-day thinking that change is bad. I still think that there's bad change and good change. I still think that something needs to happen on Garden Street. I still think that as it stands today, it's a mess.
Not many people appreciate today that it's thanks to the Calder Civic Trust and its founding members, led by David Fletcher, that the centre of Hebden Bridge, as we know it, is here at all. Because back in 1967, 7 years before Calderdale's council was inaugurated, helped by the Calder Civic Trust members at the time who leafleted people in the town, David was elected to the Hebden Royd Council with 77% of votes cast, with a considerable mandate to make significant improvements to the appearance of the town. He was shocked to be shown their secret plan for the future of Hebden Bridge.
I was absolutely astonished at the things I learnt that first evening. It was horrendous. There was a redevelopment plan, a secret redevelopment plan for Hebden Bridge, which was going to destroy the whole town. I couldn't believe it. I was sworn to secrecy. The council had this resolution that they would keep this secret because the developer, the prospective developer, had told them that if it was public it would affect property values, and by Jove it would have done, and therefore they had to keep it secret. Well, the chairman of the planning committee outlined the plan to me, and I agreed that as long as the council, a majority of the council, wanted to keep it secret, I would have to abide by that, but I would agitate to get it made public and get rid of it. There was to be a bypass for Hebden Bridge. Now, you can't say even today that it doesn't need one, but where to put one? The question then was just as difficult as it is today. The bypass was going to run along Oldgate, and demolition had already taken place in preparation for it. The magnificent edifice of Buttress Brink had gone. It would then sweep round the corner, probably demolishing the hole in the wall, taking what used to be the car park at the side of the town hall, whipping across St George's Bridge, probably taking off some, if not all, of Bridge Mill and the White Lion, and linking up with Commercial Street. It may well have been a practical bypass, but what about the impact on Hebden Bridge? Oh, you might say, what Hebden Bridge? Because Bridge Gate and Crown Street were going to be demolished, and in between those two streets were to be built single-storey, flat-roofed shops, large shops. Hebden Bridge was going to get its Marks and Spencers and its Woolworths and become a centre of great economic activity, or so the developer claimed. St George's Square, gone. Bridge Gate, gone. Crown Street, gone. I think they were going to keep the co-op, but, well, I was aghast, absolutely aghast. The following year we got another Civic Trust member elected to the council, and by arguing and prolonging meetings until the small hours, refusing to accept what was proposed, we did begin to get a bit of support from some of the councillors.
One aim of the Calder Civic Trust was to improve features of public amenity, and some areas of the town had become derelict and unattractive. In consequence, the Trust created the much-visited Riverside Walk by the Packhorse Bridge.
Hebden Royd Council decided that it would compulsorily purchase all the buildings alongside the river, from the old bridge as far as the Turnpike Bridge at West End. At that time there was a solid row of buildings along that side of the river, and most were disused, ugly and falling to pieces. At the far end, next door to what is now a betting shop, there was a large 7-storey mill with a very ugly broken cast iron fire escape zigzagging down the end of it towards the river bank. Next was a disused slaughterhouse. Absolutely dreadful. Once we'd removed all these, it enabled us to create the Riverside Walk. At that point there was a huge debate as to whether the Riverside Walk should match the other side of the river at a higher level, the level of the existing car park, with railings along it, or whether it should be lowered so that it was actually a riverside walk. As you might imagine, the argument was that if it was lower and near the river, children would get swept away and drowned in flood times. My view was that children are rather more sensible than that, and I kept the committee sitting there till midnight until they agreed with me that it was a good idea to put it lower down near the river. Calder Civic Trust awarded the Riverside Walk a plaque to celebrate the design element of it and the benefit it brought to the town, and that plaque, so far as I know, is still in position today.
The actual improvements that we did tend to be tiny little corners here and there. A little corner near the bottom of Hepton Stall Road made into a garden, one in Mythenroyd, a tree planted in the pavement at the end of Home Street. Little things like this which just surprisingly caught people's eye and didn't need a lot of time or money to make an improvement. We used to get all the planning details for this end of the valley and go through them all and put our comments in if we thought it was suitable and to do with the kind of things that we represented. We were trying to emphasise the idea that we were not against change, but that change needed to be managed to make it the right kind of change so that its long-term future was good for the town and for those that lived in it.
But the Calder Civic Trust was about to be faced with one of its biggest challenges yet. This was when developers put in plans to pull down Nutclough Terrace. This comprised houses built in an attractive semicircle behind one of Hebden Bridge's most famous historic landmarks. Nutclough Mill was once the home of the Nutclough Fustian Manufacturing Society, one of the most successful producer cooperatives in Britain, in existence before the First World War. The radical cooperators who ran this mill were inspired by the ideals of Robert Owen and built this terrace with the intention of providing quality homes for their staff. However, this historic importance did not stop the council from scheduling it for demolition. What followed was a bitter High Court battle, conducted by members of the Calder Civic Trust to save it. And, to everyone's surprise, the council lost the case and the building was saved. The effect of this was to give people the sense that it was possible to win against the council.
We used to have an exhibition every year at Mythenroyd Gala, and we used to use that to really push the ideas and the developments, the changes that were occurring. We used to particularly emphasise change that was coming and talk about where we thought it should go and try to get as many people involved as possible. We didn't want it to be elitist, we wanted it to be part of the local society, part of the local people as a whole, that they were all able to feel that they could have a say in what happened. We used to particularly emphasise change that was coming, a non-statutory body that could say what it wanted about whatever, but with, we hoped, always forethought and care.
Together with Pennine Heritage, they produced the original town and village trails for Hebden Bridge and Hepton Stall.
A somewhat later project was the Calderdale Way. As local government was being reorganised to form Calderdale, it was felt that it would be good to get all the local civic societies working together on a joint project, and preferably something that would link the whole area together. And I suppose that you could say that the first really Calderdale project was the Calderdale Way footpath. Using existing footpaths, linking them all together, and it was the first nationally accepted middle distance footpath of that kind. They've been copied all over since, but at the time it was the first that was accepted by the Countryside Commission and publicised nationally.
Some years later, after the removal of Trinity Garage on New Road, they planned the restoration of the marina, creating another well-used amenity for public events. Moving on a few years to 2008, when the 500-year-old stone setts were removed from the Packhorse Bridge as part of the Renaissance improvements to the town, Trevor Smith of the Calder Civic Trust joined forces with Nick Wilding and Lois Smith to campaign for their return. 400 people signed the petition, and after several months, they were put back. As other changes began to be wrought in the town, Lois Smith sensed that many local people felt that they had no control over what was going on in Bridgegate and the square.
Well, I think Hebden Bridge is wonderful. It's partly because its situation. I think it is really cubist, because there's so many faces of buildings that go in strange angles. They're not all like that and like that and like that. There's nothing regimented about the building in Hebden Bridge. It's all interesting. It's higgledy-piggledy, and in a way, around the river and the bridge and so on and so forth. But to look at it, every time you go down, you can see a different aspect of the buildings, a different light. I find it really inspirational as a place to live, and I love it.
Troubled by some of the decisions being made in the town, together with other concerned individuals, meetings were held in the White Lion Inn. Many people attended these meetings that became known as watchdog meetings, and then came the planning application for Garden Street, which led them to amalgamate with the Calder Civic Trust. And they supported the very proactive Garden Street Action Group in their successful campaign to stop the houses from being built. Since then, a revitalised Calder Civic Trust has cooperated with council planning officers in reassessing the conservation area of Hebden Bridge, and last year produced a small booklet about it, written by Trust member Jill Smith-Morehouse. But what of the situation today? Do we really need a Calder Civic Trust? After all, there are now Friends of Centre Vale Park, Friends of Hebden Bridge Railway Station, Friends of the Town Hall, Friends of the Fox and Goose. There are still, however, areas that have been allowed to become run down, like the approach to Maud's or the Walkley Clog Factory, once the chosen destination of countless tourists, but now an eyesore. Or like the exterior of the White Lion public house in Meidenroyd, surrounded by litter. The Woodman Inn used to be a thriving place, serving the community at Charlestown, the last public house to do so. Derelict and now unloved, it's been an eyesore on the edge of Hebden Bridge for many years now. Something needs to be done. However, there are also problems for the committee in the limited amount of time for considering planning applications for new developments that might adversely affect the town. The danger of losing heritage is today all too real. Unfortunately, the problem for the committee lies in the limited time people are ever given to consider planning applications. This building in Sheffield is the elegant Edwardian wing of the Jessup Hospital. It is Grade 2 listed and deserves to be. But the council there has ignored pleas from their own planning officers and a whole host of important societies. So it would appear that there is no longer any guarantee that a Grade 2 listing will protect the building's heritage. Of course, this was something that many local people discovered to their costs in Hebden Bridge when the Grade 2 listed original library building was allowed to be demolished. So, at a time when the government are working to relax the planning laws, what this experience shows is that it is now more important than ever to ensure the Calder Civic Trust can continue its work. However, to do this, they need more interested people on their committee and a substantial membership so that members can be contacted by email or by other means when there is a controversial plan that might adversely affect a part of the town. So with this in mind, the Calder Civic Trust has recently altered the membership fee to just £1 for everyone for life, so that it can instantly draw a maximum number of people's attention to matters that might concern them. And you're now invited to join them so that you can make your views known on any development. By doing so, you can make it possible for the Calder Civic Trust to protect and preserve this area well into the rest of the 21st century and hopefully beyond.